There's this rise in panpsychism, which is this idea that the universe is conscious. I came across this article a couple of years ago that was interesting. It was written by a guy with a PhD from Cambridge, and the title was, "Is the Sun Conscious?" And he was arguing that electromagnetic fields are a token of consciousness and that the sun possibly is a sentient being. And as I read that, I thought, this sounds like something an ancient Mesopotamian would say about Shamash. We're sort of back into this era of strange spirituality.
Greetings. Welcome back to this episode of Theologically Driven. Today, we're going to be talking about deploying Ecclesiastes in a post-secular context. I'm joined by Dr. Dunham. Dr. Dunham, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
So you recently gave a lecture series at Central Seminary, and the topic was Ecclesiastes and how to use it in fighting back against a post-secular age. Maybe we should start by defining, what do you mean by that? What is a post-secular society?
Yeah, so looking at our society today, if you go back to the early 20th century, there was a fairly influential book that came out called The Secular City. And in that book, Harvey Cox, a theologian, argued that the West, in particular, he's looking at cities in America, had reached a point of secularism where they had sort of lost any binding authority being attributed to the metaphysical realm. That sounds kind of abstract, but essentially what he meant is cities in the West, communities had reached the point where they no longer made decisions or thought about how to speak to each other in terms of public discourse in a way that was beholden to or under the authority or submissive to higher powers, be it God or something like that. So in other words, he was arguing that we had become secular in the West. And so that kind of was the state of affairs through much of the 20th century. And beginning in the 21st century, there were a number of writers around the 2010s that began to suggest that we had reached an era of post-secularism. And what they essentially meant by that was we were moving beyond some of the strictures of secularism to allow more discourse about religion into the public square. One book that kind of expresses where we were in terms of secularization was a book by Andrew Wilson, how the year 1776 remade the West, and he argues for an acronym there that we're Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, and he added ex-Christian to that and romantic, that we've been shaped by these forces that we're no longer necessarily controlled in our decision-making by God, but by these other factors in the West. And what the post-secularists are now saying is we've moved into an era where, again, religion is being introduced into the public discourse, and so there seems to be more of a spiritual zeitgeist, I guess you could say, to the West in recent years, and I've been kind of picking up a sense for that that's accelerated in the last few years since the COVID pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that everyone can see in popular culture that is happening. Even just before we started recording, I brought up a new podcast to you that's along those lines, that's on that topic. So what are some of the avenues where we're seeing this re-enchanting take place?
Yeah, so a lot of this was anecdotal, but I've just been noticing and putting together a number of factors that I think would lead me to suggest that we're seeing more spirituality in our culture. There's been a rise in podcasts that seem to emphasize spirituality. One podcast was the surprising rebirth of belief in God, and it sort of charted how there's been more of an openness to Christianity. There's other podcasts that emphasize spiritual themes, some of them coming from an Eastern Orthodox perspective, others from just a broadly evangelical perspective that are arguing that we're sort of seeing a re-enchanting of the world, and maybe we'll talk more about that in a bit, but there's just been a growth in that. Anecdotally, it seems like I'm hearing more and more about adult conversions of prominent thinkers or writers who are coming to Christianity, and this has been happening recently, different things that I've seen. I looked at the fact that the new atheists, if you go back 20 years, the so-called four horsemen of new atheism, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett. Of those four, two have passed away, Christopher Hitchens and Daniel Dennett. The other two have turned strangely mystic and spiritual in recent years. So Dawkins considers himself a cultural Christian, whatever that means. Sam Harris is going on yoga retreats.
He's
kind
a
of
Buddhist now, right?
He's talking about meditation and all that sort of thing. I pointed to other factors. There's this rise in panpsychism, which is this idea that the universe is conscious. I came across this article a couple of years ago that was interesting. It was written by a guy with a PhD from Cambridge, and the title was, "Is the Sun Conscious?" And he was arguing that electromagnetic fields are a token of consciousness and that the sun possibly is a sentient being. And as I read that, I thought, this sounds like something an ancient Mesopotamian would say about Shamash. We're sort of back into this era of strange spirituality. There's a rise in neo-paganism. There are more and more people claiming some kind of an affiliation with some pagan religions of ancient times. And so all of these factors together just suggest that we're moving toward an openness to spirituality. Now, that's not the same thing as saying an openness to Christianity, but it can include an openness to Christianity. And so as I was thinking through this, my own work in Ecclesiastes, I think, led me to the conclusion that Ecclesiastes is a really helpful book when we think about, is the world disenchanted? How do we find wonder and awe in a fallen world? I think Ecclesiastes touches on these themes. I've often said it's about finding joy in a fallen world, but that also includes awe in God as sovereign creator, living life in view of his gifts. And so I think it dovetails well with some of the trends that I'm seeing in culture that I think it can speak to this moment in a helpful way.
Yeah. So building on that, then, what is the major themes as you would see them in Ecclesiastes that help us combat this rising re-enchanting of the world, or this spirituality, but a spirituality that clearly lacks God, that lacks Christianity?
Yeah. So the factors that I looked at is when I look at the themes of Ecclesiastes, it seems to touch on what a lot of writers are currently talking about when it comes to wonder. So I was influenced in particular two books, one by Monica Parker about wonder, and then recently by Rod Dreher, Living in Wonder. And they came up with certain things that are traits of wonder, if you will. If we're going to find wonder in the world, what does that entail? Things like curiosity, things like being absorbed in a positive way in work that you do, meaningful work, experiencing awe and being transformed by that awe. More overtly Christian elements would be submission to God, attention to God through prayer and other things. And as I began to think about this more and more, I sort of saw how Ecclesiastes actually touches on these themes. Now, I don't want to anachronistically impose on Ecclesiastes that was his purpose, but what I am trying to do is draw a through line that when we study a concept like wonder and say, okay, wonder has this element, and this element, what we maybe don't intuitively realize is that we're actually touching on things that are so basic to being human that they've been part of human experience and even Scripture for thousands of years. And so I think these are touch points that we can bring out. So I reduced it to 5 things that I think Ecclesiastes helps us to do in order to find wonder in a fallen world. A sense of reflectiveness and curiosity. He uses the word see repeatedly through the book, and he wants to invite us on an intellectual exploration, to ask questions about the world, to be curious, and to think critically, deeply, profoundly about the world around us, and so to reflect on it, to see. A second thing was relinquishing control, and I use the word submit to describe this. That is, we recognize that we have limitations. We can't know the future. We're finite. We're mortal. And if we embrace the limitations rather than trying to pretend we aren't limited, and that's part of the mental health crisis, I think, in our society, is somehow thinking we can transcend our limitations to be whatever we want to be. And Ecclesiastes reminds us that that's just not the case. God has created us in a certain way, and we just need to accept and submit to those limitations and live in light of them. The third thing is absorption and flow. This goes back to a Hungarian sociologist who studied the idea of flow, and what he argued is that when we do work, we can have these moments where we lose ourselves in our work. And he connected that to wonder, that when you're so absorbed in a task, maybe you're painting a picture, you're writing, and you just sort of lose track of time, or time slows down, and you just sort of feel like you're almost outside yourself accomplishing a task. Well, this really ties into the theology of work that Ecclesiastes talks about. He uses a word that means to be occupied with or preoccupied with. And so work can be good or bad, but one of the things about work that he does touch on is the fact that it can absorb our attention and occupy our minds and give us something worthwhile to do. The fourth thing was awe or mystery to sense, and this I connected back to how Ecclesiastes tells us to appropriate God's good gifts with joy, to rejoice in his good gifts. 7 times through the book, he tells us to find joy, and he begins by saying, there's nothing better than to do this. And by the end of the book, he's commanding us, go and eat your bread with joy. So he goes from seeing it as the best option available to us to something we must do. There's an imperatival urgency as we reach the end of the book. And so this is part of experiencing this sense of God's greatness and sovereignty and what he's given us as our portion, as our lot. And then the fifth thing was attention to God to sanctify. And so the book ends with this admonition to fear God and keep his commandments, and that kind of ties together threads that have been throughout the book of fearing God as a positive thing. He says those who fear God emerge from different kinds of predicaments and difficulties, and he culminates that by at the end of the book saying, this is the whole matter. This is, as I translate it, this is what it means to be human, to fear God and keep his commandments. And so we're to devote ourselves to a reverent submission and obedience to God, and that will help us to navigate life that's full of tragedies, ups and downs. If we can fear God, it can help us to navigate that with wisdom and with joy.
Yeah. Why do you think joy is such a necessary component of wonder?
I think they're integrally related. So I would say that what has happened to my mind in the last few decades is a lot of people have become consumed with the pursuit of happiness. It's become this positive psychology movement has become, a very huge business in the West, and people are trying to find happiness. The problem is the more you pursue that, it sort of becomes this elusive thing that you can never quite grasp. It's like, to use Ecclesiastes' phrase, chasing the wind. What a lot of people are coming to understand, and Monica Parker says this in her book, is to pursue happiness is actually the wrong thing. If you pursue wonder, happiness will come with that. And so I see that too, in the sense that I think joy and wonder are interwoven, that we find joy by experiencing the sense of God's awesomeness in a way, right? Of reverencing God and seeing God's character, his power. When we can acknowledge these things, then we can find joy. So joy sort of follows in the wake of the awe we experience when we recognize that everything in life we have is God's gift to us, and we're to live in light of the fact that He's granted us these things. It's not to say life's always going to be 100% wonderful. He understands we live in a fallen world of ups and downs, but as we navigate that, if we can allow joy to govern our life and our decisions, it will help us to navigate it better.
Yeah. And though it's not redemptive in nature, general revelation is accessible to all people. And so creation, though fallen, does reflect the character of God, the person of God. So as we look and observe our world, which it seems like that's what Solomon is doing in Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, he's making inferences from observation of life in the world, and it's pointing him rightly to the God who created it, to the Creator, right? When we look at creation and we get pointed somewhere else, oftentimes internally to ourselves, that's the wrong direction, and that's I think that's where the spirituality thing messes up, because people are not being pointed to the Creator. They're taking the creation and twisting it in such a way. But then when you link the joy and wonder as you look at general revelation and creation, and you look to God, that's how it's supposed to be. That's the intention.
I would agree. Just to build on that, I'm thinking of how Jeremiah in his book compares idolatry to broken cisterns. And the sense there being that idolatry is a form of spirituality. You're worshiping something. It's not the right God, but it's something that gives you a sense of awe, a sense of reverence. But in the end, it's a broken cistern. It doesn't really hold water. And this is what a lot of people are doing, is recognizing that scientific materialism as a worldview has run out. It's exhausted itself. It's not really it doesn't produce a satisfying and fulfilling human life, and so people are looking to other things for that. But if they're turning to these broken cisterns, it's going to be a temporary relief, perhaps, or seem like it's the right thing. But in the end, you're kind of right back where you started from.
Yeah. So as people are turning to these the idolatry, broken cisterns, how can we use the major themes in Ecclesiastes to fight back against this? How can we deploy it?
Yeah. So what I would recommend is that we really tackle the book and wrestle with the book, that we take opportunities to teach through it and to preach it in our churches. I recommend usually taking 12 to 15 lessons or sermons to work through the book and really emphasize these 7 calls to joy. These often come at culminating points in the book. They grow in intensity as the book goes on, and they come at strategic junctures in the book. And so what I would recommend is to think deeply about the book. It's been a book that I think, unfortunately, because of interpretive trends in the 20th century, has sort of been held at arm's length for many years because many interpreters, many commentators take a negative view of the book. They see it as skeptical, as jaded, the best humans can come up with. I mean, of all the commentaries on my shelf, probably at least 2/3 to 3/4 of them take a negative view of the book. And what I'd like to do is recover a positive, sympathetic view of the book and to preach through it, not letting the negative things be the last word, but the positive things that he's leading us to be the final word. Because I think the message of the book resonates with a culture that's looking for something, looking for answers, looking for satisfaction, not finding it, feeling dejected and despondent. And Ecclesiastes, although on the surface may seem bleak at times, what he's saying is, if I can look at the worst that the world has to offer, meaning the most tragic circumstances in a fallen world, if I can still navigate through those and ultimately find joy, then there's hope that wisdom can help us toward a course of life that's meaningful, satisfying, and even filled with joys in those moments. As he says in chapter 7, that there will be many days of adversity. We're to remember them, but there will also be many good days, and we're to rejoice in them. And I think that's a wise rule of thumb for how to navigate life in a fallen world.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Central Seminary has posted the lectures that you gave there and also the notes that came with it. So if people want to find those, I believe I looked through them. You gave out an outline for Ecclesiastes and then a recommendation for breaking it up to preach through it. So that could be a real helpful resource for guys. So if you would like to find that or learn more about those lectures, you can check that out at Central Seminary's website. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Dunham, for coming on the podcast today. And thank you for listening to Theologically Driven. We're a podcast of Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary. If you'd like to learn more about our seminary, just go to dbts.edu.